Postface, Marxism and Poetry. George Labica. Poetry must have practical truth as its aim. Paul Audiobook and its fate. Henri Lefebvre's metaphilosophy has had an unusual fate. Written in Strasbourg in 1963-4, it was published by Editions de Minute in 1965. Its appearance went almost unnoticed, and until now it has not been reprinted. Why such a silence, followed by such oblivion? Was the title to blame? Is metaphilosophy any more obscure than metaphysics or meta-language, a term quite commonplace at that time, or again metapsychology, which Freud risked at the end of the 19th century? Metaphysics, Lucien Levy-Brawl, metamathematics, or metalogic? In the English-speaking world, the term metaphilosophy has been used since 1940. In France, Lefebvre's word and his project were taken up by Costas Axelos, despite other people's preference for post-philosophy, and a journal with the title Metaphilosophy has been published in the United States since 1970. Subtending all these approaches is the notion of an after-philosophy, as meta-discourse and meta-theory. I should add that many bibliographies fail to mention this book, and no scholar did justice to it until a recent thesis by a Korean academic. One and what justice, as M. Dimyoung devoted no less than 900 pages to La philosophie politique d'Henri Lefebvre ou la politique de la métaphilosophie, with a confident handling of the material, near exhaustive knowledge and pertinent judgment that might well confound indigenous researchers. In 1965, Henri Lefebvre had already published some 20 books, including La Somme et le Reste, and the first 2 volumes of Critique of Everyday Life. In the field of Marxist thought, and well beyond it, he held an exceptional place, not confined to that of an initiator. Le Marxisme, published in 1948, was and would remain the best-selling title in the Puff Q size collection. The reason for this lack of interest, or lack of attention, I believe must be sought elsewhere, precisely in the conjuncture of the time. In 1965, metaphilosophy found itself wedged, literally short-circuited, by the simultaneous publication of Althusser's 2 works, For Marx and the collective volumes of Reading Capital. To the historical moment, which we will not dwell on here, saw the sudden transition from a humanist Marxism, challenging, iconoclastic and utopian, to a Marxism that proclaimed its scientific character and recited certainties. This transition was a double paradox, as it replaced one figure of Marx by another. The philosopher still inscribed in his time, that would be the sense of Lefebvre's metaphilosophy, referring both to his superseded predecessor, Hegel, and to the latter's perverse successor, Heidegger, made way for the scientist sure of his epistemological breaks and master of his concepts. But perhaps these are simply 2 sides of the same coin, in a 2-way swing that history has accustomed us to, or rather thanks to which a certain history, that of Marxism, can obtain legibility, either Feuerbach or Hegel, materialism or dialectics, structures or human beings, science or philosophy, and so on. But perhaps things are not so cut and dried. Let each protagonist of the time, some are still around, reflect and question his own sedimentations. On the other hand, a change of this kind, beneath the appearance of restoring the combativeness and novelty of Marxist thought, could not afford to drape a new cloak over all these omissions. Individual, subject, desire, tragic, Lefebvre would say, which revolutionary romanticism or historicism Gramsci had, despite their weaknesses, the merit of pointing out. A similar condemnation of Stalinist dogmatism, on the part of both Lefebvre and Althusser, did not lead to the restless research of the former, with the risks of its lack of assurance, but rather to the comfortable intellectual sovereignty of the latter. What we should resolve to call a certain national spirit, more inclined, in the tradition of the 18th century, towards scientism than utopianism, for is certainly contestable here. It is true that, as things turned out, the PCF's opportunist jumble sale and inadequacies, prey to its notorious backwardness, were scarcely an incitement to adventures immediately perceived as regressions to the pre-Marx, idealist, anthropological or empiricist. Vis-à-vis the Althusserian Flint, Lefebvre appeared only too friable, to the point of being effaced in favor of someone like Roger Garrotti, whom the performance of the famous Central Committee meeting at Argenton placed in the role of an alter ego for Althusser in responding to Lefebvre. 5. This false reciprocity, which passed unnoticed at the time, sealed the eclipse of Lefebvre and the impasse placed on his metaphilosophy. For the conjuncture would now open a new paradox, with the advent of May 1968, while the majority of its actors were inspired by revolutionary romanticism, those who challenged the PCF from within, petty bourgeois, intellectuals and academics, rallied to the Althusserian positions. The revolution, which in principle could legitimately make use of two supporting currents, was going to sacrifice one. Or at least, obscure it, if only for the time being, since everything leads us to think that today the scales are swinging back in favor of Lefebvre. Before I go on to argue this, a further word on the genuinely emblematic character of the two men, Lefebvre and Althusser, who dominated French Marxism and were the eponyms of the two currents, always disconnected, even though, nota bene, still today people say Althusserianism and not Lefebvrism. It is hard to imagine two more different temperaments. On the one hand, Lefebvre the nomad, the adventurer, the beater of paths, investigating space, time, human relations, categories and concepts. On the other, the sedentary Althusser, a man of the study, who perceived the world through the keyhole of his office at the École Normale Supérieure, the controller or customs official. The one listens, changes, betrays, a disloyal investigator of the new. The other decrees, repeats and fixes the tables of the law, in the rigorous concern for doctrinal purity. Lefebvre took Althusser into account, read him, broke lances against structuralism, accepted the competition. Althusser, already in the preface to For Marx, committed the unbelievable injustice of ignoring Lefebvre, when he deplored the absence of Marxist theorists in France and formed the project, a quite personal one, of returning a little consistency to Marxist philosophy. Althusser, the latecomer to theoretical struggles, 20 years after Lefebvre, offered himself the luxury of contempt towards his elder contemporary, something that some of his disciples would be sorry for later on. I am caricaturing a bit, of course, having loved and followed both of them. The metaphilosophical design, Lefebvre was, along with his friend and enemy Sartre, the last encyclopedist, interested in everything, and stimulated by everything, in the role, however, of contrabandist. He was, as he said himself, though in neutral terms, not explicitly, a man of frontiers. It is quite true that in the conditions of the modern world only the man aside, the marginal, the peripheral, the anomic, the one excluded from the horde, George Gervich, has a creative capacity. The man of frontiers tolerates a tension that would kill others. He is both within and without, included and excluded. Following paths that are surprising at first, then become routes and are eventually taken as self-evident. He travels along the lines of the watershed and chooses the way that points to the horizon. He may happen to pass by promised lands, but he does not enter. This is his test. He always heads for new lands, towards the horizon of horizons, from moment to moment, until he perceives the distant outlines of an unexplored continent. His passion is discovery. He can only proceed by going from discovery to discovery, knowing that in order to advance, He has to master a need to know that whispers to him to stop here and there, to excavate. 6. But let this be understood. Thought arises at the frontier, where power and the will to power stop. 7. Philosophy brings new concepts into Marx's doctrine, such as that of everyday life, a gain through which a frontier is founded, an edge, making it into a metaphilosophy. 8. Here we have it. Metaphilosophy is an important book. Very important, Lefebvre himself emphasized, if my memory of our conversations on this subject is not deceptive. His most important? Possibly. In any case, a watershed book in his work, if we look at what came before and after. Not the most systematic, as Lefebvre had no system and was not even tempted in this direction, but certainly one of his most accomplished, perhaps the most accomplished, at all events the most synthetic and best organized. It gave form to what had come before, and paved the way for his great undertaking, the Critique of Everyday Life, the third volume of which, we note, was subtitled Towards a Metaphilosophy of Daily Life. 9. Assuredly a center of Lefebvre's work, but in his own style, between negligence and reference. The object of metaphilosophy is clear enough to define. It is a question of taking seriously the last of Marx's theses on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world, in various ways. The point is to change it. 10. The revolutionary project, Lefebvre writes, has rebounded. It has taken back its full character, to change the world and life. We are no longer in philosophy, but beyond it. 11. The task was to accomplish, in its full scope, the slogan of André Breton that linked Marx together with Rimbaud. 12. To supersede philosophy. That is what meta is, the after, the beyond, Marx's Veranderen and Rimbaud's changer. Lefebvre's Q Penser, 20 years after metaphilosophy, returns at many points to this little word, meta, to be found everywhere that something, pulled along and becoming, goes beyond itself, metaphor, metaphysica, metamorphosis. 13. Its extension is even considerable, meta. The human being always goes beyond himself, beyond what is acquired, beyond consciousness and what escapes consciousness. Language only proceeds by metaphor. Supersede? Overcome? It is a chance to attempt, an act, whether successful or not, but necessity consists in a transition or transgression of the real, towards something other, towards a possible that may turn out to be impossible. 14. This transition from philosophy to metaphilosophy, which Lefebvre tells us is very long-standing in his work, since it goes back to an article published in the journal Philosophies, in March 1925, 15 presupposes, first of all, a critique of philosophy. This critique Lefebvre would articulate, in the wake of metaphilosophy, on the basis of three categories that he saw as fundamental, praxis, poiesis and mimesis. The first is taken directly from Marx, denoting the relations between human beings and social activity, and cannot be separated from the historical, which includes the possible. The second relates to the appropriation of nature around the human being and within him. Yet it is distinct from and even opposed to technology, being the creator of works. Its scope is that of total man, freed from the division of labor. The third, which cannot be reduced to mere imitation, extends to all activity that takes place according to a form and adding to this form. It is inherent in educability and makes possible exemplarity, filiation and affiliation. If it cannot avoid either formalism or conformism, it remains nonetheless a mixture or mediation between praxis, representing one level of this, and poiesis, which it refers to. Philosophy is a particular case of mimesis. Logological, egological, tending towards the schizoid, philosophy can take its place among the pleonasms, those autonomized, automatic forms of mimesis. From then on, it turns its back on praxis, which backs up its critique, and must definitively renounce an accession to poiesis. In order for a power, in the Lefebvrean sense, such as religion, politics, technology, mathematics or philosophy, to arrive at the stage of autonomization is the worst of outcomes. It amounts to forbidding itself any creativity and substituting the product for the work. Analysis of a process of this kind explains how Marxism was able to degrade into its opposite, an orthodoxy that set up the economic as an autonomous power. 16. Certainly Marx was careful to avoid this, emphasizing that the economic was only determinate, but at places he left the door open, and Engels still more so, for successors less careful of nuances and desirous to dispose of a system. The critique of philosophy, the summit of autonomized power is the state. Marx demonstrated this, referring in his early writings to foreign powers after the model of Feuerbach dismantling the hypostases of religion. Lefebvre would constantly return to this theme and deepen it, first of all, in the critique of philosophy, as philosophy is partly bound up with the state. 17. Between state and philosophy there is a historical connection. The state encompasses and perfects all partial systems, including philosophy. The collapse of the Hegelian system expressed the collapse of philosophy as theoretical system, and the collapse of the state as practical system. Two hypotheses can be envisaged. If the proletariat breaks the state, it establishes its dictatorship, which can only be provisional, and heralds the withering away of the state, coinciding with the realization of philosophy, as there are concrete, simultaneous realizations of the formal aims of philosophy, freedom, truth, good, etc., and of the formal representations of the modern political state, liberty, equality, fraternity, justice, etc. If things do not happen in this way, if Marx's prognosis is not correct, then the state maintains itself and philosophy along with it, with its existing characteristics in aggravated form, as it is then in the service of the state, politics and the bureaucracy. Only a connection of philosophy with the state and the bureaucracy can assure it a certain effectiveness, and public honors for the philosopher. In this way we reach the heart of the critique of Stalinism. The attack on philosophy uncovers, on the one hand, as one path among others, but certainly a privileged one, the concept that governs the entire critique, that of alienation, to which Lefebvre remained indefeasibly attached from one end of his work and life to the end. Metaphilosophy is, in parts, the culmination of this, though Lefebvre still emphasizes its limits. Immoderate use of the concept leads to a mystical vision, abundant in fairly inoffensive literature, ignored by Heidegger, at the center of philosophy and ideology, formal expression of the theory of the idea, p. 275. Metaphilosophy exhibits the concept's positivity. Philosophers by definition decided against non-philosophical man and the world, viewing these as alienated. By showing that there is also a philosophical alienation, Marx united under the same concept philosophical man and non-philosophical man. He opened the way to the superseding of philosophy. The bottom of the matter is that philosophy was unable to assimilate alienation. The theory of alienation signifies that philosophy sought to say what man is and what he can become. It also signifies what philosophy did not manage to say, still less do. And yet, which is the lesson of Marx, the path of alienation is also that of disalienation. 18. It is possible to distinguish in metaphilosophy, and elsewhere, a double critique of philosophy. The first critique bears on classical or traditional philosophy, in fact all philosophy, inasmuch as metaphilosophical thought intends to grasp it in its essence, itself enlightened by the crisis that marks its dissolution. In this way, Lefebvre presents 11 aporias or antinomies, p. 47 ff. that are characteristic of philosophical reflection, whether speculative or supposedly critical. The charge against contemporary philosophy is still more bitter, in that this continuing philosophy represents an aggravated situation and finds itself either enslaved or floating, instrumental or inconsistent, incapable of waging theoretical battles. The philosopher may well cling to science or art, or get bogged down in his own history, but he has lost all function, except when he becomes promoter of official ideology and raison d'etre. Hence the many rebellions that philosophy arouses against itself. No one needs philosophy or the philosopher anymore. He does not really watch. If he awaits, it is with the same waiting, the same hope or the same despair as other people, those of the everyday. Lefebvre is not generous. Besides structuralism, his bête noire, which ostensibly prefers the prosthetic limb to the living limb, 19 and cyberneticians of all feathers, who provide the most perfect model of pleonism, 20 he would later attack still more mordantly his most visible contemporaries, Sartre, Foucault, Lacan and Freudianism, Lévi-Strauss, in the intermezzo to QSCEQ Penseur. 21 he would return to the charge and be laid at, to fustigate a certain left-bank intelligentsia and its avant-gardism. Philosophers, in a dying philosophy, symptomize the decrepitude of existing society. They contribute a bit to this themselves, let us say in their honor, while believing themselves to be renewing it. 22 residues. What is philosophy guilty of, and philosophers in particular? Of leaving residues. The residue is certainly the newest and most original concept of metaphilosophy. It is possible that Lefebvre borrowed this from John Stuart Mill, whose method of residues 23 he appreciated, but he would confer on this a far more considerable extension. The residue is the consequence of the process of autonomization. It seeks to express precisely what is expelled, the singular and freedom expelled by the state, desire and subjectivity by cybernetics, drama by mathematics, speech by language, the non-philosophical, the everyday, the ludic, by philosophy, and so forth. It is precisely to metaphilosophy that the task falls of conceiving these residues, which are at least as precious as that in whose name they are rejected by the closed worlds of powers that have become autonomous. The everyday is precious, insistently raising the question, is the residue not what is most precious? Did not Marx himself exclude Homo ridens and Homo ludens, focusing exclusively on Homo faber and Homo sapiens? Apostrophe infinitely precious, too, are history and historicity, which both structuralism and globalized, mondialisé, technology cast aside. 24. Precious, again is complexity, praxis, dialectic, the tragic, emotion and passion, the individual, all treated as negligible quantities. And is not nature itself residual, when the human and the automatic are associated to produce the cybernanthrope? 25. Under the reign of the understanding, 26. Which only knows stabilities, residues multiply. Mimesis, which makes the world into spectacle, 27. Tends to eliminate the individual, keeping only a personage without reality. Why, one may ask, this leitmotif, this red thread that pervades Lefebvre's whole work? Because the residues, these rejects of systems and specializations, are truly irreducible. They are the irreducibles. The residue resists. It manifests itself, becomes essential. the critique of philosophy means nothing more than this. It consists in wagering on the ensemble of these residues, the unease and discontent irreducible through and beneath fragmentary satisfactions, everyday life, youth, deviance, underdevelopment, and so on. p. 300. This is the method of residues, which not only seeks to detect them and reveal the precious essence, but also to unite them, organize their revolts and totalize them. Gathering the residues is a revolutionary thought, neither utopian nor prospective. It confers its style on metaphilosophical reflection, whose unclassifiable character comes from the fact that it takes the unnameable as its point of departure, in other words, the ensemble of residues. As we shall see, this method has its successors, but it is possible to mention, at its origin, the figure of Feuerbach, to whom Lefebvre refers only rarely. In fact, when he analyzes the relations between philosophy and anthropology, and particularly when he asks, is not what remains of philosophy, in the direction of its superseding, an anthropology? He finds himself very close to the old master, who asserted, truth is uniquely anthropology, uniquely the point of view of sensuousness, intuition, as only this point of view gives me totality and individuality. 28. Attention directed at these residues cannot be without radical questionings, and it is significant that these appeal to the same constellations of concepts, sensuousness, individuality, totality, alienation, split, poetry, and so forth. The superseding of philosophy. In this way, we already find ourselves in the superseding of philosophy, or rather in superseded philosophy. It is necessary, then, to return to it. Starting, as did Lefebvre, with the philosopher who pointed towards superseding, but did so only to abandon it, in other words Hegel, admired and detested for this, p. 21 ff. The famous Hegelian term Aufheben, one of the most important concepts in philosophy, precisely indicates and reveals the noob of the problem, and of all subsequent difficulties, given that it means at the same time abolish and raise, suppress and realize. Hegel inaugurates the critique of philosophy. He proclaims its end and supersession by denouncing the essence of philosophical discourse. At the same time as he prepares the succession, Marx, he constructs the perfect system of the understanding, a system which we know is responsible for all ills, that is, for the residues. Superseding, Aufheben, or the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, signifies for Lefebvre neither the pure and simple abolition of philosophy nor the continuation of traditional thought, even if renewed. It opens the way to a movement, a complex becoming, which no specification of classical philosophy can define. To the apogee of philosophy that Hegel reaches, to the desire to have every residue absorbed by Logos language, to total speculative alienation, p. 23 ff. We have to oppose Marx's project that the becoming philosophy of the world gives way to the becoming world of philosophy, revolutionary realization, and superseding of philosophy as such. The union of philosophy with the praxis of the proletariat would make possible the provisional form of dictatorship of the proletariat, which represents the condition for the state to wither away, this being identical, as we know, to the withering away of philosophy and, well beyond this, of all autonomized powers. 29. Paradoxically, Stalinism confirmed this necessity in concrete fashion. It has contributed to the death of philosophy and the metamorphosis of philosophy. Praxis, which Marx took over from Hegel, shows the way of historicity, which refers neither to sociology, nor to psychology, nor to philosophy, the way of superseding, which would enable man to dominate his own works, to fully appropriate these works that are both nature in him and his own nature, in other words, to arrive at poiesis. or more exactly, as this is Lefebvre's position, to rediscover poiesis and return to it, after it was lost and forgotten. There was a time, in fact, when philosophical speech and poetic speech were not distinguished, they were both bound up with praxis, itself dominated by poiesis. The poet-philosopher knew the laws of the city. He could decide on them. He was political. The split, which Lefebvre would describe in La Présence et l'Absence as an immense silent catastrophe, 30 generated the mimesis that retains something of the earlier stage, at the very moment when philosophy separates out, fortunate ambiguity, the chance of a misunderstanding. 31 In this we can read the possibility of superseding, of a new alliance reunifying word and speech, concept and imagination, giving back meaning to the metaphors of the philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Kant, even down to the rose of the powerful and ponderous Hegel. The time in question was that of the pre-Socratics who reflected before the great split between poetry and philosophy, between creating and making, first among these Heraclitus, but also Democritus and Epicurus, pages 124, 150 ff. The whole history of philosophy can be appreciated on the basis of this criterion of presentiment or intuition of the split, thus of the superseding. 32 We find here the philosopher-poets of ancient Greece, but also Fourier, from whom Marx started out. Nietzsche, above all, is present here, as he understood that man had to traverse the death of God the Father in order to put an end to a divine cut off from praxis. His approach to philosophy has to be taken up and extended to the economic and its history, politics and its state, and art, also separated out, ibid. Nietzsche has the merit of having badmouthed Socrates' Homo Philosophicus and praised his predecessors. 33 It is he who is to be credited with the idea of a new alliance between poetry and philosophy. Among his contemporaries, Lefebvre accords particular interest to Sartre, distressed at seeing in him an exemplary form of failure. Despite striking intuitions and the presence of the future and the possible in the project, this excellent philosopher, blocked by his Cartesian starting point and his reference to Husserlian consciousness, maintains the gap between lived experience and history, this lived experience, nausea, bad fifth being simply another name for the everyday. And Sartre leaves too many residues, the absence of history and being and nothingness, but also of nature. To Sartre, we should contrast Heidegger, 34 even if he too does not go far enough in the critique of philosophy, because he reflects on concrete physis and poetry, equally ignored by Sartre, because he does not confine himself to making, like Sartre, but takes into account production and creation. Heidegger praises the thing, das Ding, not the object or the product. He rehabilitates it in the face of science and technology which have destroyed it. The thing is the work of the creative activity that founds a praxis. After the marks of the 1834 manuscripts, after Nietzsche, Heidegger re-establishes the sensuous or the practico-sensuous in its richness. Questioning of being and physis tends towards the superseding of philosophy, and yet Heidegger halts before the metamorphosis of the everyday, of Alltäglichkeit. Attentive to drama, he missed mathematics and number, which attain the qualitative. He disdains the human sciences, and his design does not even have a sex, p. 138 ff. Finally, however, he alone saw the essential thing, technology, which makes for a shift of all problems, and above which Heidegger has to be acknowledged as having placed poetry. The critique of philosophy then receives support from both phases of the split. There exists a before, when play, knowledge, religious, cosmology, poetry and political activity were not separated, that was the time of the festival. And then after that sees the reign of mimesis, that of the understanding, of discourse and analytic rationality, the philosopher contemplating in it his broken mirror. The watchers, the city, the great separation did preserve, all the same, some watchers charged with indicating the way to metaphilosophy, by preserving, having rediscovered it, the message from the beginnings of philosophical thought. Does this Lefebvre express, in Lefebvre, nostalgia for a golden age? Does it relate to an origin myth? At all events, it possesses letters of nobility that it simply inherits, Heidegger, to be sure, and his admirable studies on logos, aletheia, physis, etc., which stimulates us to study in the same fashion praxis, techne, mimesis, poiesis, etc. Nietzsche and his watchword of a return to the Greeks, Hegel, before them, and his fascination with Heraclitus, and we should not forget Marx, who devoted his doctoral thesis to Democritus and Epicurus, as well as Engels, who waxed eloquent on the marvelous dialecticians that the Greeks were. Palmism, among other examples, from the time when he and Lefebvre were still linked by a tie of friendship and engaged in similar theoretical struggles, and who wrote a book-length manifesto on les matérialistes de l'Antiquité. 35. An attitude such as this, nostalgia reduced both to its simplest and strongest expression, seems to me to signal the basic concern, wish, desire, for Lefebvre that philosophy should be, or again become, a work, that it should be productive, creative, in a word, open to all proliferations of life. Apostrophe the work does not describe, does not imitate. It metamorphoses. 36. The superseding of philosophy means nothing other than this, the superseding of philosophy, that is to say, philosophy as a work. In the same way that, with negative hindsight, the state was bound up with philosophy, so the latter, in positive projection, that is, once it is superseded, encounters its most explicit metaphor in the city. It is no accident that Lefebvre should take the city as figure in his critique of Sartre. For Sartre, the city has nothing to do with creative work, it is simply the inert. But the city is the supreme work, the work of works. 37. Like philosophy, the city has known its period of non-separation. When society and state coincided with the city, this was the preeminent work of praxis, the most perfect thing. Like philosophy, the city underwent a split, with a few vigilant watchers within, Baudelaire, whose most vibrant poems express this, Apollinaire, Cendrars, the Aragon of La Passion de Paris, among others. And like philosophy again, the city perceives its own end. It is perhaps in the process of disappearing. The urban phenomenon, by developing, becomes disconnected. Now the idea of its end, as again for philosophy, seems far more productive and creative than that of its continuation. Lefebvre would certainly not have disapproved of Italo Calvino, who seems to echo him in describing his book Invisible Cities. I think I have written something like a last love poem to cities, at a time when it is becoming increasingly difficult to live there. 38. Poiesis. It is time now to come to the word that, as we saw, focuses the entire problematic of metaphilosophy, that of poetry. The association of poet and philosopher, already met with, sums up Lefebvre's ideal and gives a name to the object of his critical effort. To the prose of the world, alienated thought, it is absolutely necessary to oppose the rose of the world. 39. Poiesis. From the pre-Socratics to Octavio Paz. 40. The figure of the poet-philosopher remains the model. Lefebvre himself sought to conform to this, mingling strictly theoretical analyses with poetry. 41. For poetry is not distinguished from truth. Metaphilosophy repeats this proposition at several points, with a certain stubbornness. Apostrophe originally and deeply, poetry is truth and truth poetry. The before of the split speaks for its after, which must be brought into being. Apostrophe residue among residues. Metaphilosophical poiesis would thus be both poetry and truth. This truth would no longer have anything in common with that of philosophy. Certainly, Lefebvre is not unaware that he borrows this maxim from a man who remained his friend throughout his life, Paul Éluard, the aim of poetry being, across time, practical truth, Éluard. And we know that the phrase poetry must have practical truth as its aim is to be found in several of Éluard's collections. 42. One rediscovered poem, titled Les Philosophes, would surely not have displeased Lefebvre. Too long they have laughed, the laugh of an intact vessel, of money sure of itself. They laughed at some unfortunate words that the poor used in the way that people kill themselves, in self-defense, believe, love, dream. 43. The concept that poiesis is designed to reinstate, and to which it pertains to metaphilosophy to give a new depth, is that of totality. That is why, from the very start of this book, in relation to creative praxis, total history is presented as the aim of poiesis, or better still, as a strategy, the gathering of the residues. Themes again connected to this total history. The history of the city would make a convincing contribution. The modern world is a totality, which it is necessary to explore in order to know the ruptures that break it. In itself, metaphilosophical thought attempts to reconstruct a totality, and first of all to reunite poetry, or rather poiesis, and philosophy, at a higher level than that of their ancient split. For Ambrosio-ified philosophy proved incapable of using the concept of totality. It proved equally incapable of overcoming the crisis of this concept by using that of worldwidness, mondiality. Apostrophe man is total. Philosophy can only spoil this totality, both close and distant. It must leave room for a renewed praxis by poetic decision. This is the path that superseding realization imposes. To give the lie to Adorno's observation, which Lefebvre cites here, philosophy continues, as its superseding did not take place. The favorable moment was missed. 44. The critique of Marxist philosophy, or of what purports to be such, not only the critique of traditional philosophy, represents this missing, and finally offers the favorable moment at which only a return to Marx can return the acute and trenchant character of these blunted concepts. In particular, that of the possible, which Lefebvre places at the center of Marx's thought, Marx thinker of the possible. 45. May I simply suggest here the interest that the comparative perspective of three philosophies would present, philosophies that, starting from different premises, grant the Marxist category of the possible the status of a principle for deciphering the real and a lever for its transformation. Ernst Bloch, Jean-Paul Sartre and Henri Lefebvre have in common the same project, in that for all of them utopia is in no way presented as a product of the imaginary or of dream, but rather as a dimension of reality susceptible to ensuring its superseding. 46. This is again the terrain of Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Lefebvre as metaphilosopher. The problematic of metaphilosophy did not remain isolated. In the copious corpus of Lefebvre's work, this is attested by a number of his books published after 1965 that can be called philosophical, in particular Q Penser, La Présence et l'Absence, which is perhaps the closest, and Un Pensée d'événement. We get the impression that Lefebvre, who no more liked to quote himself than to multiply quotations from authors he was indebted to, sometimes forgot his own metaphilosophy. Thus it is absent from both La Présence et l'Absence and Un Pensée d'événement, apart from a rare allusion, 47, whereas it is explicitly referred to in Logique formelle et Logique dialectique 48 in Q Penser, in which Lefebvre asserts that the question what is thinking explains the aporias presented in metaphilosophy, and that thinking was precisely what the first Greek philosophers had glimpsed. 49. It sometimes seems that Lefebvre softened certain of his judgments. Thus on pens a devenement, starting from a parallel made between Costas Excellos, who privileged philosophy, and Althusser, who opted for science, marked a certain hesitation, when he asked whether Marx was not at the same time one of the last philosophers, in the classic sense, and one of the first meta-philosophers, if not the first, or in raising the question what was philosophy in Marx's time, and for Marx. The 11th thesis on Feuerbach is judged false here, on the pretext that philosophers always wanted to change the world, 50 and unjust towards speculative philosophy. Apostrophe the strategic hypothesis of the conclusion even appears regressive. We take up Marx's approach on the basis of philosophy. The philosophical continues. Is it on the decline? Is it rebounding? Does it keep a relationship with Marx's thought? Is Lefebvre rejecting, or at least qualifying, his own thought? I do not think so. Lefebvre never read the theses on Feuerbach as the radical abolition of philosophy, but rather as the project of its realization by the abolition of the proletariat, consigned to the final lines of the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, an 1843 manuscript. And he says this often enough. In fact, Lefebvre was mad about philosophy. The hazards of his career, which made him a professor of sociology, are entirely explained by the narrow conformism of the philosophical institution, which refused to give its label to someone who did not possess the requisite colors. He was mad about philosophy from the start, from the abortive philosophical renovation of the 1930s, 51 until the end of his life, 52 as can already be shown by the imaginary dialogue in QSCEQ Pensor. p. 64 ff. A kind of modest confession, which likely explains some essential themes. Here and there, in the same book, certain accents à la Victor Hugo should not deceive us. 53 Lefebvre cannot escape from philosophy, but only continue philosophy by radically transforming the philosophical attitude while, to a great extent, keeping its problematic, p. 320 ff. The contribution of metaphilosophy, however, is not confined to the adoption of this position, no matter how fertile. It presses us to emphasize a number of other lessons, genuine weapons to counter the contemporary phenomena of broken weapons, intellectual resignations, and the complacent announcement of all ends, in the sense of death, that serve only the perpetuation of capitalism, for a time triumphant and without competition. In a tradition, Judeo-Christian, both austere and hypocritical, and continued by media ideologists among others. 54 How can one not raise one's hat to a philosopher unafraid, more than 30 years ago, to take as subjects of his thought, indeed? The jukebox, nylon, plastic, alcohol, synthol, cybernetic animals, courtly love, supermarkets, gadgets, cover girls, Brigitte Bardot, Marilyn Monroe, Sylvie Vartan and the Yeyes, plastic materials and injection molding, or the mass media, alongside harmony and counterpoint, Solver, Rameau, Bach and Courin, just to stop there. Hence likewise, Lefebvre's style, his speech, rather than discourse. Colorful, lively, striking, often lyrical, as it was in everyday life. And an explorer without borders, blinkers or taboos, one of the first in our country, if not sometimes the first, to read and write on Nietzsche, 55 Heidegger, as well as Marx, 56 Hegel 57 and Lenin. 58 A tremendous beater of new paths, ranging from dialectical logic to rural life, the city and urbanism, everyday life and the state. 59 On these last fields, as Lefebvre preferred not to call them, we shall not draw up a bibliography. It would be too long. A politics of the everyday, we shall, however, make two remarks that speak also for tomorrow and the days ahead, whether they are joyous or not. The first consists in wishing for the arrival of successors, in these matters, along with the concepts that they advance. To give just one example, the state mode of production, even if we should welcome the audience encountered outside France, one example being the work of Anglophone Marxist Urbanus, above all David Harvey. 60. The second, which more strictly concerns our object here, metaphilosophy, seeks to emphasize that despite subsequent qualifications here and there, as mentioned above, this has not only maintained the exact presence of a continuous reflection, but in its most adequate trace has proposed the design of a politics to which we are still invited. This politics developed first of all in the persistent work that marked a long phase in Lefebvre's life, the Critique of Everyday Life, begun in 1947, continued in 1962 with a second volume, and completed in 1981 with a third, which we have already noted was nourished by metaphilosophical reflection. I would like to point out, as an exemplary case, that one of the approaches to everyday life in metaphilosophy starts from the attention given to the nuclear danger. We are dealing here with a new object that illustrates Lefebvre's method. The nuclear danger, for the first time and for a long time to come, places over the whole of humanity a threat of death. This is no longer a matter of representation, but of lived experience. Life and death are fogged and mingled. Men discover that they are in a state of survival, and that they have always been so. The dialectical unity of life and death, being and nothingness, has ceased to present itself in a speculative view. We are beyond philosophy. And it is precisely the consciousness of this phenomenon that creates the conditions of its superseding, which contributes to constituting worldness, mondalite, in praxis. It is no longer possible now to think and live as before. The modification that matters concerns everyday life, which in modern societies can no longer be equated with a style of life, something that, on the contrary, contains the split of real life into separate sectors: work, private life, leisure. Between these sectors there is just one form of unity: passivity, non-participation, the repetitive, submission, the mimetic. Is everyday life to be treated as a residue, a notion that we encounter here? Or rather is the world and life to be changed? 61. A notice of this kind, directly issuing from praxis, does not simply confirm that thought is also constituted by considering everydayness, excluded by philosophy. 62. It calls for resistance. The everyday and its rejection put in question, fragment by fragment, the whole of the modern world, which is intolerable, unacceptable. That is why the critique of everyday life, and this alone, could thus combine the multiple contestations into a bundle. The totality of contestations and the contestation of totality, that is negativity, are only reconstituted on the basis of the everyday, ibid. The everyday provokes the insurrection of the particular, the levée en masse of the residues. This is the politics set to strike at the heart of the capitalist world. Once dogmatisms of every kind are rejected, of every school and tradition, starting with Marxism, socialism can draw from this a renewed force, mobilizing and offensive. It will finally become, as Lefebvre liked so much to repeat, Dionysiac. The party of supersession of philosophy and metamorphosis of the everyday constitutes a party. Is it necessary to say that the ranks of such a party are potentially more numerous and better identified today than they were in the 1960s? Think, for example, of the new political spaces that are opening up almost everywhere, and the constantly growing set of anti-systemic movements growing everywhere in the world. A strong analysis of this kind, like that of José Luis Revelado, for example, intersects and brings fully up-to-date Lefebvrean positions, from the categories of the possible and of concrete utopia to social microprocesos and microrealizaciones, or the culture of resistance. 63. It is not hard to imagine which side Henri Lefebvre would be on, at whom he would rail and to whom he would dedicate his enthusiasm. He would find himself in the party of the excluded, those residues that our societies of abundance proliferate ceaselessly, on the side of the wretched of the Third World, the Zapatistas, Palestinians or the peasants of Brazil. Metaphilosophy, by denouncing the moral trickery that creates the illusion that belief in technology could put an end to bureaucracy, whereas in fact it serves it. 64 goes as far as suggesting the political form of these combats. Can we then count on technological thought rather than a renewed democracy to realize the withering away of the state and the replacement of constraint over men by the direct management of things? p. 148. We know in what direction Lefebvre would extend this reflection today, when he defines the contract of citizenship in terms, and with demands, that render the present-day consensus derisory. The heretic, on the contrary, the iconoclast, the permanent dissident, persists and, in the last lines that he wrote, signs off by reasserting his conviction that civil society must reabsorb the state and politics, which would complete, democratically, the abandoned project of the dictatorship of the proletariat. 65. It is up to us to remember this lesson. George Labica, Summer 1997. This book is licensed to Rowan Jennings, RMJ 2131 at Columbia.edu on September 5, 2016. Notes Introduction. A Study of Productive Tensions. 1. Henri Lefebvre, Metaphilosophy, 2nd edition, Paris, Sileps, 2001. For Lefebvre's career, Remy S., Henri Lefebvre et l'aventure du siècle, Paris, A.M. Métailier, 1988, is invaluable. English studies of Lefebvre include My Own Understanding Henri Lefebvre, Theory and the Possible, London, Continuum, 2004. Rob Shields, Lefebvre, Love and Struggle, Spatial Dialectics, London, Routledge, 1999. Andy Merrifield, Henri Lefebvre, A Critical Introduction, London, Routledge, 2006. And Lukasz Stanek, Henri Lefebvre on Space, Architecture, Urban Research, and the Production of Theory, Minneapolis, University of Minnesota Press, 2011. Tout le droit à la ville, Paris, Anthropo, 1968, translated and edited by Eleonore Kaufman and Elizabeth Lebes as The Right to the City, in Writings on Cities, Oxford, Blackwell, 1996. Pages 63-181. La Révolution Urbaine, Paris, Gallimard, translated by Robert Bonanno as The Urban Revolution, Minneapolis, University of Minnesota Press, 2003. Marxist Thought in the City, translated by Robert Bonanno, Minneapolis, University of Minnesota Press, 2016.